this now, but is your surname Armenian?
It is. It is
Okay.
Armenian. Yeah, that's a good pickup. Thank you for asking. Awesome.
I have quite a few. I used to when I lived in London, a few Armenian friends, and I was like, I'm sure Richard's surname is Armenian, but I'll ask first before I assume.
Yeah, no, and we're like, so there are like Armenian people and they're like Armenian people, and we would categorize as the latter. Like my wife is Armenian, like we're very into the Armenian
Okay, so like
community. Yeah.
properly, I love that.
Well, good day, Leanne. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to be joined by Leanne Mair this morning. And well, it's morning. We were just talking about the software. It's morning for me. It's afternoon for you because you are in Munich, as we
I am
previously
indeed.
discussed. Yeah. So I'm so excited for you to be here, talk about your work, about your book. But before we jump into any of that, would you mind just kind of giving a little introduction to yourself, please, Leanne?
Yes, happy. Do you know something?
Hmm.
Giving introductions are always
Oh, it's awkward. I know,
the
but
it's always the tricky bit because you're like, which bit should I start with
right,
first?
right.
So I will start with everything in a nutshell. So
Okay.
my whole being, my whole why is all about helping fixing systems rather than fixing women. So I
Okay.
look at
I like
how
that.
can we fix and improve systems to
Mhm.
create more opportunities for women in different facets of their life. So
Mm.
looking at that, I look at the workplace,
Mhm.
and that's kind of within the retention space, but also women in leadership, but then also looking at the pipeline piece, and that's how I express myself in all these different hats. So I am the founder and CEO of Benefactum Consulting, and
Right.
we work primarily in organizational transformation and strategic management consultancy,
Mhm.
and that's focusing on gender equity in the workplace. So what can organizations do better in order to create pathways and opportunities for women who are being kept out due to systemic barriers?
Right, right.
Then I'm also the founder of the Sororum, which I
Mm.
think in the US you call them FGPs, first generation professionals. And I
Yeah.
think in the UK and Europe we call them first in family, supporting young women from minoritized and marginalized backgrounds to move into professional services,
I
because
love it.
that in and of itself is a nuance. But for us, what the important part is not productizing these young women, but getting organizations to do the work to make sure that they are creating the culture and the environment to ensure that these young women can thrive. And then, as you mentioned, my book,
Yes.
I'm also the author of Closing the Gap, how to include Black women in any gender equity strategy,
Mm.
which is coming from the standpoint of, once again, organizational transformation. What can organizations do in order to take
Mm.
meaningful steps without requiring that Black women are the solution or putting the burden upon them to solve the challenges and the systemic barriers that they face within the
Right. Why do
workplace?
they have to face why does the burden have to be placed upon them? Right. That's
Hmm.
exciting. So
Correct.
I love this. We have so many aligned paths here. One thing you
Mhm.
just said that resonated with me because I've spent a lot of my career in software development. And one of the things that I've always kind of led by is you don't change the people to fit the software, you change the software to fit the people. And you just said the systemic aspects of this, right? So
Mhm.
you're not trying to change the people, you're trying to change the systems, right? So
Right,
that I love
right.
how that sort of aligned. The second thing that you talked about was this first generation, right? And
Mm,
to me that really resonates as well. I do a lot of work with first generation college students of all backgrounds, right?
mhm,
But just the idea of like being the first person in your family to go to university, right? And oftentimes those folks are coming from marginalized backgrounds and are, overcoming
mm,
significant challenges in order to be that first person to go to college in
right,
their family, right? So I love
right.
the work that you're doing there with first generation professionals as well. You talk about the authenticity and the intentionality in which you live, and can you talk a little bit, Leanne, about how that kind of guides your style, I guess, as a
Mm,
leader, the work you do at Benefactum in
mhm.
particularly, please.
I would say, and I would say this to anyone who's listening, getting to be authentic and
Mhm.
getting to be intentional is a privilege that I cannot understate. I fully. We're often sold, be your authentic self, be intentional.
Mm,
But the reality is, it's very difficult to exist like that for so many reasons, especially when
sure.
you're within an organization. So for me, it was taking a step back and actually saying two things. One was, to be authentic means that not every opportunity that presents itself is an opportunity. And am
Right.
I willing to be able to say no to
Mm,
something that seems like an opportunity to everybody else and everyone's
right.
like, you should do this? Or am I willing to sit in the pocket of, no, this is where I want to be because
Mhm,
this is my vision, my strategic vision,
right.
but this is the authentic part of, this is the way Leanne works, this is the way I want to work, and this is how I'd like to express this within
Sure.
the organization. Um, which is not always easy because
Yeah.
it's recognizing that you might have the vision, you have other people to help you implement that vision, and those are two very different languages. um, so for me, kind of being able to be authentic and intentional were two things, just like with equitable practice, they take time,
Yeah.
and it means that there are so many other things I could have done in terms of kind of client choice, in terms of where I show up, in terms of who I work with, for speed and purely for, financial gain. But the piece around wanting to be able to, A, be proud of the work that I do and we do, but B, being able to really say, each decision that I've made has been a decision I've actively taken.
Right.
Um, rather than it happening to me, was a really important one, and that's kind of something that I use as my focus locus, all of those things, to make sure I kind of stay on track.
And that I would have to assume that that has to have evolved over time, right? You talked about it, again, intentionality in the decisions that you make, client choices, sometimes speed, all these things kind of get in the way, right? And it's
Hmm.
challenging to think about that. How as you have evolved, and I can tell you're a student of organizational behavior and obviously transformation, right? As that has evolved, Leanne, over time, I'm sure there's always more work to do, right? That transformation
Right.
is never truly complete, right? And that, yeah,
Never,
yeah,
never,
absolutely.
never. I think there's this part about, we kind of we kind of been trained to think there is a place when we get there, that there is
Mm,
a there, that once you've done it, you've got to the point.
mm,
But I think one of the things that we sometimes don't talk about enough, even within leadership, is dynamic leadership. That a
mm.
fundamental pillar of leadership is you need to be dynamic.
Sure.
If at any point, and it's kind of, I always say to people, I'm not an expert, I
Right.
have expertise. And the reason why I like to
Oh, I
make
like
the
that.
differentiation
I like that.
is, I feel like when people label themselves or are labeled, it's not always something
As an
that you give to
expert.
yourself.
Sure.
It becomes static, and a lot of people, once they've been labeled an expert, don't necessarily believe that they need to learn anything
More.
more,
I agree. I
because
agree.
they're like, I'm an expert and that's
Yeah,
it, and that's where I'm going to sit.
sure.
Whereas my growth journey is continuous, and actually my expertise continues to grow. And sometimes the things where I started, or the expertise that I had at the beginning, have kind of, when I say feel petered out, not because they're not relevant,
Sure.
but you're reacting to a market, you're reacting to a political climate, you're reacting to so many things that only maintaining one expertise doesn't get you further. And I
Mm,
think that's the thing for me, that I seek to be dynamic, I
yeah,
seek to continue to learn, and um, if I had to say, what do I pride myself on? I pride myself on my intellectual curiosity.
I
I
love that.
don't like to sit. I like
Yeah.
to know, and I want to know why, and I need to know why, even though I shouldn't need to know, but I do, and it means it takes me longer. Like, I
Sure.
can absorb a lot of information, but I can
You
be
process.
sidetracked.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's this term that I've heard kind of growing the last couple of years, Leanne, right? And that is agile leadership. And to me, there is a very important distinction between dynamic leadership and agile leadership, because I think agile leadership, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this, agile leadership is sort of rooted in the notion of like, we're going to make business decisions, or we're going to think about different performance indicators in a way that is agile, and we're going to react right? But it's still very much focused in the react mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems, yeah, I can tell by your expression, you're feeling the same way.
Yeah, like literally, as you said it, I was like, agility to me is reactive.
Right.
When you are agile, you can react to something. Whereas I feel dynamic leadership is I am actively seeking places where I can
Yeah.
be proactive and create
Mhm.
change, but
Mhm.
they might not be in the spaces that I had originally
Thought so. Yeah.
intended. Right,
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
That's a big difference. Amazing. Let's talk about closing the gap. So, your book, Closing the Gap, you discuss the challenges that Black women face in the workplace. You obviously, I don't want to identify as a Black woman, right?
I do. I
You
do
do. Yeah.
identify as a
Yeah.
Black woman, so don't
Yeah.
worry.
So I know you have a background both in Brit Jamaican, I think is how I read your description, right?
Yes,
Yeah, which
correct.
is very cool. So you've certainly had cultural experiences that I'm sure have shaped your journey. But let's talk a little bit more about the book. And I was intrigued by, the blind spots that you are kind
Mhm,
of trying to bring to the surface there when it comes to gender and racial equality. Can
mm.
you talk a little bit about some of those blind spots?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I will say just in general, above and beyond kind of racial and gender equity, I will say a lot of organizations focus on solutions and
Mm,
they fail to look at unintended consequences of those solutions.
mm,
um Namely, here, this is what we're going to do. And I think in a broader, let's say, diversity, equity and inclusion context, we're seeing that pushback, which is we're focusing on this one group and then we have pushback from another group that says
sure.
we've been excluded. And I think a lot of the times, because the people who are making the decisions, the decision makers, the leaders, are not necessarily from marginalized and minoritized backgrounds, when they make decisions, they base that naturally, as we all do, on our experience,
Yeah.
their expertise, but they fail to bring in the lens, in this case, of what it means to be
For a Black woman.
a Black and be a woman.
A woman. Yeah.
Um, and it's usually that piece around, and I'm just going to take employee resource groups or business resource groups
Sure.
as an example. You have an employee resource group for, I think some of them are like called BOLD, which is usually like for
Sure. Sure.
Black
I know the bold movement. Yeah.
employees.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or then you have, the WIN, the
Right.
women's initiatives, right? Um, both of which are useful. But if you are a Black woman, you belong to both, yet neither really address
Right.
those particular challenges. And I can't remember where this report was. It was like a few years ago, which talked about when you belong to a particular group, be a woman, whichever minoritized or marginalized group, when you support that ERG, people don't necessarily believe you're doing it for the greater good. They believe that it's self serving.
Mm,
So when you look at that as a context, if you are within a group has that supports one of your social identities, either your gender or your race, and you're like, but hey, I have other challenges because I sit at this intersection.
right.
The response is usually going to be, okay, well, you only care about you, rather than, oh, there are a broader set of systemic challenges that we need to
Right.
address. And addressing the most narrow is not going to,
Yeah.
help everybody. But if we address the largest amount of kind of systemic challenges, then we're helping more women than we're not. And I think this is sometimes where things go wrong, which
Right.
is they say, okay, we're looking at women, yes, but if we look at the way feminism has worked, we're still not addressing Black women and women of color. We're still primarily, even when we're looking at gender equality and parity to men with pay, what we're looking at is the pay of white men being equal to the pay of white women. We're
Right.
not looking
Not
at the pay of Black women or Latina women. We're
right.
looking at the top level rather than looking
Sure.
at the lowest level, to mean that if we solve all the problems here, we're helping everybody on the way up. And I
Mm,
think these are some of the blind spots that we continue to face.
right.
Um, and sometimes I think it's a challenge in the articulation. Sometimes I think it's a willful decision not to want to engage with them because there's a fear of, I don't want to talk about this and we have stuff for women or we have
Mm,
stuff for Black people.
mhm.
Um, but it continues to be a blind spot that we're not, in my opinion, we're not seeing organizationally, we're not seeing enough of a shift
Yeah.
that's not purely focusing on leadership, but then leaving the pipeline somewhere to flounder.
That's a really good point that you just made about the leadership, and I did want to ask you a little bit about that too, because of you talk about affinity groups, and that's fine, and okay, whatever, right? Affinity groups, I feel like become a check mark that an organization just makes. Like we have an affinity group, check, we're done, right?
Right,
We have a leadership development program, check, we're done. And I did want to talk to you a little bit about, is there a disproportion, Leanne, in the focus around more of the, because not everybody is interested in a leadership track, right?
right.
So how do you balance those black women who are not interested in leadership but still need to have investment and removal of blind spots, and then of course there is those that are on leadership tracks and who have leadership intentionality. I'm just curious about, again, some of the most impactful strategies you've seen that support Black
Mm.
women's career development, whether it be career development on a leadership track, on an individual contributor track. Does anything particular stand out to you, Leanne, as being particularly impactful or successful?
Yeah, so I would start in two places.
Mm,
I would say, this is, I mean, at Benefactum Consulting, we do leadership development
mm,
programs, but I'm going to say we do them with a difference.
yeah.
Um, the reason being is that they are not necessarily correlated to your organizational seniority.
Mhm.
What do I mean by that? The qualities that we say a leader should have in any organization are qualities that any
Yeah.
employee should have, right?
Regardless of
Yeah,
gender or
right,
race. Right. Yeah. We
right.
get caught
Like,
up in that sometimes and forget that it's the same,
right.
right? Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, we want somebody to understand how they can be proactive. We want somebody, if they are of a if they're strategically minded, to know how to lean in that type of,
Right.
workflow. We want to understand if somebody is more operationally focused, how
Mm,
do they, how can they still build a career and not be penalized
sure.
because we overweight the value of being extroverted, we overrate the value of being strategic. But what
Mm,
about people who are just good at operations? So I think in many cases, it's to your point as well, it's organizations need to do a better job of identifying what is it that your female employees want. I
one.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, we do a survey called the Experience Chasm Survey, which is around
Mm,
the experience of Black women in the workplace in Europe. And, as we were going into creating the survey, one of the things that I was very, very clear on, and I've been clear on this in my messaging for the past 3 years, is stop asking people how they feel exclusively and ask them, what is it that you need to succeed?
yeah. Yeah. Yep.
um,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
we end up in this space of subjectivity, and someone says,
Mm,
well, I don't think it's that case, and I, okay, fine, we can spend years discussing how you view it versus how I perceive it, etc.
sure.
But what can't really be negotiated is if I am telling you explicitly, this is what I would need. Now, it's not to say that everything is possible, it's not to say
Of
everything
course
is
not.
realistic,
Yeah. No, right.
but creating organizations being able to create that funnel to have that conversation.
Mm,
What is it you need? There will be thematics that will come out
it will come out of that.
irrespective.
Sure. Sure. Yep.
Whether it's you survey 1,000 women within your organization of all genders, I mean, sorry, of all races,
About races. Yeah.
irrespected, races, ethnicities, cultural heritage, you do a survey across the spectrum, there
Mm,
will be thematics of as to what is needed, because there will be intersecting experiences that might say, look, I need help working on my executive presence. I need help learning how to use Excel, right? And writing macros. It doesn't always have to be these really kind of overstated, overblown things that people need to be able to progress and to get visibility.
sure.
Um, it's how can you enable somebody to be able to showcase the value that they bring, their value add to the organization to the best of their ability.
Right.
And that's why sometimes I think the framing's wrong. So for our part, that's kind of where we start with these kind of leadership modules is everybody here, do they want the same thing? As
Yeah.
you said, is this a leadership track, or is this a I would like to develop some personal skills in order to be better at my job,
Be
which is
better
still
at my
very
job.
important.
Yeah, or a conflict resolution or anything, right?
Right.
A whole host of things that could come out of that particular survey that you do. I appreciate, Leanne, there's this human sort of centered design that I'm hearing from you, right? And the
Mhm.
contextual aspects of it. You do have a background in social science, anthropology, government history. How do you incorporate? I can hear it already, but I'd love to hear it from you. How do you incorporate that into your work? Through is it through this contextual approach, through this kind of human-centered approach that you're doing?
I think we get so I love the way you have framed this,
Mm,
because I think a lot of the times I think of two things. There's kind of my human centric approach
mhm.
versus the methodical approach that needs to be reflected
Yes,
somehow
yes,
so that it's
right. You have to
understood.
quantify somewhere, right?
Right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And that's where I came up with our four-step methodology, which is called
Ooh,
the DARE methodology,
ooh, I love
which
methodology.
is
Let's talk.
which is diagnose, assess, recalibrate, and embed.
Okay.
And usually where organizations are is they're assessing stuff and they're like,
Mhm.
this is what we need to do, but they've not gone through the diagnosis piece to
Right.
get to the root. They usually have primed, like you have these employee engagement surveys.
Oh, sure.
They're primed. The answers are primed. People
Yes.
that, the person who's typed this engagement survey wants you to say a
Yeah, they're
particular
they're
answer
leading
so
you
that
in a path. Yes, absolutely. Yep.
and this is where for me the value add comes
Mm,
in, kind of, I think, the way my brain works and hopefully the way it then comes across, which is my ability to read situations, but giving and creating space so
mm,
that each person can speak. And I'm not going to label it as a safe space, because I know that there are so many connotations around that.
right.
But I will say a space that is open, that is moderated, so that we can start to get to the roots of the challenges, as
Mhm.
opposed to this is my challenge, because it's easy to say, okay, what's my
Root
challenge?
cause.
I'm not
Yeah.
progressing.
Mm,
Okay, but the reason you're not progressing could be you have a bad manager. The
right.
reason you're not progressing is that you might need to work on ABCDE skills.
Mhm.
um and it's kind of, how can we take that approach but then get to that point where you say, okay, out of all of these things that we've got, and usually it's a hell of a lot of impressions, what are the three most impactful steps your organization can take?
Can take. Yep.
That's like, these are the three most impactful things you can do. The assessing part is, but this is where you are and what you have
Mhm.
today. Because I would say there is a kind of proneness to wanting, not from my side, but you see like a lot of consultancies going and they're like, yeah, everything you're doing is rubbish. Let's just start from the
Yeah,
beginning,
throw it away, start
which
over. Yeah.
yeah, which obviously I just think is a bad idea. Meeting organizations where they stand is also being able to extrapolate, like, what do you do well and
Yeah.
what do you do not so well, and how can we take these three parts of impact and interweave it with what you already do and do well, so that there's something recognizable that allows the organization to start to begin to endorse what
Mm.
it is we're suggesting. But it also feels attainable. It doesn't feel overwhelming, because that's the other part, right? Overwhelm is real. And I think most people, especially kind of CHROs, chief diversity officers, CEOs, the C suite, are feeling overwhelmed just because there is so much.
There's so much to do. Yeah, I mean, there some of them are purely in survival mode, right? Both for the organization, and
And
I mean, and themselves. I care less so about themselves, but certainly for the organization and its people, they're in survival mode, right?
hmm hmm
Absolutely. Um, there's been, I mean, we started this podcast as a reaction to what we saw in sort of DEI programs that were kind of just like shouting, but not really doing anything, right? Like, and we we knew that we wanted to do a show, and we knew that we wanted it to be around a topic that was really important to us. And what we saw was a lot of people making a lot of noise on social media and other platforms about, about inclusion or about diversity, but not really doing it, like not doing anything about it, right?
Mm.
And certainly DEI as a movement, every movement is circular, right? I mean, there's high points and low points. Leanne, where do you think we are right now, right? In the work that we have done and still need to continue to do?
I love that question. And I
Mm,
could probably sit on my soapbox for about 20 minutes with that
yeah,
question.
sure.
So I'm going to say the first part is I think we have to admit that we are not as far along
Yes.
as we would have assumed.
Yes.
And the reason why I say that is that I made a video at the beginning of this year. I don't know, I think it was on LinkedIn or YouTube, I'm not sure, but I just basically said, gender equity 2024 is not, oh, we're going to be doing all of these huge initiatives. It's
Right.
actually recognizing and realizing that a lot of fundamental work just didn't happen in the
Didn't
past 3
happen.
years
Right.
as we assumed it did. And I think, and I talk about this in my book, that there was a knee-jerk reaction, which we've all accepted, right?
Sure.
And then I think 99% of organizations thought they could workshop it away. They could sign commitments and nobody would care.
I just wanted to fast forward to the end of it, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
then it would be BAU. But
Right.
I think what's happened is, and I discuss all of this also in my book, is that
Mm,
there's been two parts. There's been the organizational challenges and not being able to make change. But then there's also been, from the practitioner perspective, being able to deliver workshops was to all intents and purposes, a get rich quick scheme. Um, but the reality is that it's not just about that. It's not
mm,
just about kind of trying to make people feel morally good or morally bad. It's how can we start to look at the governance that supports behavior that excludes people from minoritized and marginalized backgrounds. We have to start to look at what's there.
yeah.
Um, and that was kind of avoided for a long time. And I think there are so many people out there doing amazing work that
Sure.
are taking their organizations through this systemic approach. The challenge comes when you are, and I'm not saying that reporting isn't required. I'm
Right.
just saying the challenge comes when you have to report yearly, A, and to expect change within a year is pretty much overly ambitious.
Right.
So, all these organizations run to do their reporting, but B, when you have to do all of these different types of kind of ethnicity pay gap reporting, gender pay gap reporting, and you can still decide to say that you don't disclose it, etc., where does the line of accountability come? And I
Yeah.
think this is where we also are, is that the line of accountability can't always come from employees, because there is still a power dynamic, there are
Mhm.
still expectations, there are still challenges that you as an individual will face if you are deemed a troublemaker. Um, so
Yes.
it
Yeah.
it's it's not for the employees to always have to rally. And I think we
Sure.
saw a lot of employee activism last year, but unfortunately, the BRG ERG affinity group fatigue is real.
It's
Like,
real, right? Well, and there are other, look, we live in a very, I guess I'll use the word dynamically in, right? But we live in a world where things are changing all of the time,
mhm,
right? And there's a lot going on right now. And people are, you have to, it's hard to divide yourself, right? So your focus changes and things change, right? But I really appreciate what you just said about the individual actions versus sort of the organizational actions there, right? I'm actually going to pull on a quick story. So at a job, I won't say the name of the job, but with a company I was at, I needed to hire, and at one point in time, I looked at all my finalists that and again, you talk about the unconsciousness, but I looked at all of my finalists and they all looked like me, all my
mm,
finalists of this position that I was trying to hire. And I was like, oh shit, like all of my three finalists, they all look like me. And I
Mhm.
went to my CHRO and I said, I think I need to reset. And the CHRO was like, no, you need to get this job filled. You know? And it was like, "No, I need to reset," you know? And we had this, like, back and forth over
Mhm.
it, you know? And then believe it or not, the position ended up getting canceled. And maybe that was a result of me taking too long or what, who knows, right, Liam? But I really appreciate what you just said about the individual actions versus the organizational sort of like, I don't know if action is the right word, but ownership or
Mm.
responsibility as part of this broader change versus
Mhm.
like, because then you say like you're the troublemaker, Richard, because like you delayed this because, so interesting that you said that. Yeah.
It's I always find language also really interesting because, you can have activist investors, you can have
Mm,
change makers,
maker. Yeah.
but within an organizational context, if you display any of those characteristics, you're immediately labeled a troublemaker. Um, it's those things where you're just like, oh man,
Yeah.
come on, like it's really not that. But I think this is the other part of the challenge that so many people face individually
Mm,
is, what are the consequences going to be
right.
if I take this particular action?
Yeah. Yeah. And then thinking, I can't risk that, right? Because I
Right,
have all of these things, a family, kids, whatever, that I can't
right,
risk. So again, I'll retreat into silence or whatever because of the consequences.
uh,
So important. Yeah, so important.
right.
I was talking to a young black woman over the weekend who has aspirations to do things that no one in her family has ever done. And
Hmm.
what's holding her back right now is her romantic partner, right? Because he does not believe does not believe in the things that she is doing. And that's like consequentially, like, what do you do? Do you tell your romantic partner, sorry, like this isn't going to work out because I have my own, right? My own aspirations that you're not in support of. So there's always consequences, right?
Hmm.
It's so challenging.
I mean, if you were
Yeah.
asking my answer,
Yeah.
I would say yes, tell him
Yeah.
to go away.
Right.
But I like the other the other reality is, I don't know if she's in her early 20s.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I can still remember I was at university and how do I phrase this properly? One of the boyfriends I had during my university period, I wanted to go to the US. I wanted to come stateside for a term because I wanted to experience the whole
Sure.
sorority and everything. And he just wasn't for it at
Uh,
all. Like, just gave me hell about it, and I didn't go.
yeah.
And whilst I
Oh,
don't regret any of those things, because
sure.
had I
Sure.
done
Sure. Sure.
everything, would
Yeah.
have had a completely different trajectory. It's this part of never, and coming back to your other point about people having to make decisions,
Sure.
we got to a point for sure in the last years of becoming very judgmental of people
Mm,
who couldn't always prioritize the bigger picture
right.
because they had individual
Well, and
challenges,
it's they always say the little things are the things that matter, right? I
right?
mean, yeah, yeah,
And I think that's another, I think for me that's like another factor, which is,
yeah,
you know, and I and I say this as much to myself as to anybody else. You will probably never find me on the street protesting because that's not who I am. It doesn't mean
sure,
I care less. I just to
right.
choose to
We
I
all have
just
we all have the way in which we feel most confident and comfortable participating in whatever, right? Yeah,
right.
yeah,
And
yeah.
and that's the point. And I think it's part of the conversation
Mm,
is, each of us has a role to play. Some of us are in boardrooms, some of us are protesting on the streets, some of us are protesting in schools, some of us are protesting in hospitals. We
right.
we all have a role to play, but we shouldn't judge each other for making decisions that we perceive
Yeah,
on good enough, because I think it's I think the first sentence in my book is context is everything.
Yeah.
Um,
And that grabbed me because again, contextual interviews, those things are extremely important to me,
mhm,
right? And so that grabbed me, like you said, your context is everything.
right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think we and this is like slightly left field, but one of the things that does concern me is that we are starting to live in a society that no longer provides context.
Mm.
It's, we have
Well, we look at like a
snippets,
3 minute a snippet. I was just say that you look at a 6 second clip on TikTok. There's no context. You're just seeing that 6 seconds. You don't know what happened
right?
before it. You don't know what happened after it. So you only believe that 6 seconds, right? Or whatever it
Right.
is. Yeah.
And and therein for me is therein for me is kind of like the challenge and the problem,
Mm,
which is of all of the, let's just say we're going to clip it, or you're going to clip this, or your team's going to clip this, and we're probably going to put like a 2 or 3 minute video out there. And of course, the clip is designed to gain people's interest,
right.
which we recognize and realize. The challenge is that a lot of people aren't necessarily putting, Club Shay Shay and Cat Williams aside, aren't willing to watch, 45 minutes worth of long content
I
to
know it.
get
Yeah. Yeah.
context. Yeah, you know it better than me, right? To get context, to get depth. Um,
Yes.
and this is kind of part of the challenge within organizations, which is every senior leader doesn't have the time always to provide context. That
Yes.
is the
Yes.
real
And
challenge.
that's just the
So then
reality. Really.
so they're making decisions based on their context, but that context is not widely known.
Mm,
And this is, I believe, why, we talk about transparency. There can't be radical transparency, but this is why there's elements of transparency. This is why there has to be thought around it and
sure.
intentionality when you're being a leader to say, look, I will be making these decisions that will affect X amount of people. They are not privy to every single decision that I have to make. However, there is part of my duty as a leader to provide context
Mhm.
so that it becomes not only more relevant, but there's understanding as to why I've taken the decisions I've taken for the broader, for the broader organization that has an impact on every individual.
Hmm. Leanne, before we let you go, I always like to ask people a little bit about, their forward sort of aspirations. We're still fairly early in the year. I mean, April is rapidly coming to a close. May is right around the corner, which is crazy. I'm sure you have aspirations for a benefactum group, other initiatives that you're involved in. We actually didn't even really talk about say it for me. Uh
Sorora.
Sororum, thank you. And then
Yes.
or Black Women Parlay. Maybe we can talk about those for a minute as part of your aspirations for your initiatives. Um, where are we going this year? What do you want to get accomplished this year?
It's what I really, really, really want, especially for the Sororum, is I want to A, take it global, but B,
That's cool.
um, I really want organizations to understand that it's not that difficult to work with first generation professionals. They just have to be willing.
Mhm.
And it's I spent the last year and a half probably pre-book kind of socializing with a lot of very senior people the concepts as to why equity in general is needed.
Mm,
And I think I hope for this year that with the work I get to do, it helps organizations move from this socialization perspective and really start to move heavily into the diagnosis phase. Because once you get to the root of the issue, which is the heavy lifting, seeing where you are and how to maximize that is the easiest piece because you already have the foundations. So I think for benefactor consulting specifically, I want to work more and we want to work more absolutely within the US, but kind of getting organizations to do this fundamental diagnosis work is what I really, really want. Definitely want to work more in the US, but I'm also hoping that a lot more organizations commit to the diagnosis part of things.
mm,
Um, because what's happening now is what I'm going to call like a false assessment,
sure.
where It's receiving, I'm going to call them copy paste strategies are that are organization agnostic, but you just send them along.
Yeah.
Um, but that they kind of take that step and take that step with us as benefactor consulting to really want to take a slightly different approach to what they used to, but
Mm,
that encapsulates long-term and sustainable methodologies, but also bringing your employees on the way, because I think the one of the biggest divergencies right now is employee loyalty, because there's no
yeah.
reason to be loyal.
Right. There is no reason. And organizations are more scared of employee loyalty than ever before, right? I know here in the United States,
Mm,
the job market definitely has turned and there is, once again employers kind of have the upper hand because there's a lot of folks looking for work right now, right? But 2
mm,
years ago certainly that wasn't the case. Even a year ago that wasn't the case where, employees were able to move around very freely and didn't have to worry about that. But now there's a little bit more, but you don't want to be loyal for the wrong reasons either, right? So
right.
that's therein lies the challenge. I have to just say, Leanne, thank you for doing the big work here on this. I really appreciate that you and your organization are doing the big work. Um, Benefactum Consulting, everything that you're doing. The book is called Closing the Gap, and we're going to make sure that we have all of your links and socials all as part of the conversation. Bring it together. Benefactum Group. I'm sorry, not Benefactive Consulting. Benefactum Group. The book is called Closing the Gap. We're going to link up the socials and everything so people can get the book if they're looking to get it. Thank you for taking the time to discuss these challenges Black women face in the workplace. It's so important. And again, thank you for doing the big work. And sorry for the little bit of power surging there, but we'll put all this together and
No
provide the
worries.
conversation. Yeah, thank you.
It happens to the best of us, and thank you for
Yeah,
the invitation and taking the time. And I look forward to seeing it, and I'll make sure that all the socials are sent across to you.
awesome. Good deal. Good deal. Well, thank you again. And really, really, we appreciate it. And good luck with everything you're trying to accomplish. Thank you for doing the big
Thank you
work.
very much. Thank you so much. See you and have a great
See you.
day.
You too.
Bye.